Solish, for your kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to connect via Zoom with your Chabad in town congregants and members of the Atlanta community. And yes, thank you, David, for being the catalyst for this visit. This evening, I'm with you all to share my story with you. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew in our blessed United States of America. Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told had she survived. It is also a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family, as it is here for most of us all today. Never did we think that the anti Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother, and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on, and it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our immigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, Jewish books, Sefer Torah, were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Shoah. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, our apartment was ransacked. All valuables were thrown into a pillowcase and taken away. But worst of all was that they transported my father to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 3 weeks only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, We were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure day to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded on board ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable. My mother, father, brother, and I shared two small rooms. We all ate in a communal dining room, and at that time, there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever-present, terrifying 12-foot high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded. And it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, causing incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday mornings, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. At 11 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, the trains left for their destination, and of the total 120,000 men, women, and children that departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take one knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, our fears began to mount. Adults suspected, and they somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their weapons and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old, and to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evenings, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star, which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other. And this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. We were placed in this particular section of the camp with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine, who the British put under house arrest because they were citizens of an enemy country. Unfortunately, this hope never materialized for our family. 600 of us 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress. And this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very fortunate that I was able to share a bunk with my mother and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine 2 adults, 2 strangers sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions? A bunk that was no larger than the small cot bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy, there was no toilet paper, there was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slosh through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peels. Bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. My father, who was ritually observant and became even more so as time went on, refused to eat the so-called soup because it contained non-kosher meat. He would daven and later fill in secret whenever possible. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you've all heard, you've read, your students have studied And you most likely, most definitely have seen movies and true documentaries about the Shoah. But the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror, and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there's a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games, and one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find four pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the four members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find the third or fourth pebble? Might that mean that one or two of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked, and somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. In our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure if I had cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. We did not know that Auschwitz, with its gas chambers, had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they were going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive, and who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burnt leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over the homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here, 35 pounds. And my mother weighed a mere 70 pounds. The Russians, in a crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also relearned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. Weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. Flowers were in bloom. Birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation, and this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother Albert actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I'm relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story of how we gradually recuperated and were sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in a children's home, in a youth aliyah home, in preparation to live in what was then British mandated Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society. Had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old. I had never been in a store. I had no idea what money was all about. Had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. Meals served us were delicious and nourishing. And you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had issued what was known as the White Papers, restricting the number of Jews permitted into the land. They were intercepting many of the refugee ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus, and in some cases, turning the ships back to Europe. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Arabs and Jews, which in May 8, 1948, led to the establishment of Israel. In 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, Our illegal voyage from Holland to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And because parents at that time were not permitted to accompany their children, my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of 3 to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948, Erev Pesach. By coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was the Hayas, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. Never, ever heard of Illinois, definitely not Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language, my third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the 4th grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time. I actually made time to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan, who I had met at the age of 16 on Yom Kippur in Shul in Peoria. And we are so grateful to have celebrated our 67th wedding anniversary this past August. Nathaniel, come say hello to these nice people.
Hello, nice to see you.
That's Nathaniel. He's wonderful, tremendously supportive, and none of this technology, Zoom stuff or whatever would work without him by my side, without him making it work. Right, Jordan? Jordan knows that, and so does his father, David. Besides that, Nathaniel was a pilot in the Air Force. I think you ought to know that. He was an Air Force pilot and very, very disciplined. Everything has to be exactly, just like my father, everything had to be exactly right. The dot over the I had to be right over the I, not a bit to the right and not a bit to the left. And that's how Nathaniel is. Not easy. Okay. I am grateful. I am very grateful to have survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have 3 grown children, all 3 are happily married, and they've given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 7 magnificent great-grandchildren. Amazing, amazing. And in March of 1996, my memoir, 4 Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Pearl, was published by Green Willow Division of HarperCollins. It is now in its 33rd or 34th printing in hardback, available in paperback by HarperCollins. It's a 20th anniversary edition, and they decided on a new cover. I don't know if you can see this. I don't like it, and it's due to the barbed wire that's on the cover, but they were in charge, and I had very little to say about that. Anyway, that was it. Has been translated into German, into Dutch. Oh, and Scholastic Book Club has made it available since the late 90s. Has been translated in Hebrew by Yad Vashem, and they did a super job on theirs. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? Yes? Okay. And if you like, you may all read it in Japanese. But above all, I am so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. And I'm thrilled that a documentary has been made entitled Marion's Triumph, with the actress Deborah Messing as the narrator. It's been aired over PBS stations throughout the country these past several years. So you see that despite all the terrible things that happened to me as a child, my life today is full and rewarding. Although I've spoken to upward of 1.5 million students and adults over these past 20 some years, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you all, and particularly with our young people, because in a few short years, we will not be here any longer. It is today's generation that is the very last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask the students when I speak in schools to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that they read and hear about. Share them with their friends, share them with their relatives. And I ask them to someday, please share these stories with their children. And yes, even with their grandchildren. When we are not here any longer, it is today's youth that will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Shoah must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us, to isolate us, and to set us apart from the rest of society. This, of course, represents the Star of David, our Magen David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol. But the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction, and such terror from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance and compassion towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes, around the kitchen table, dining room table, wherever we gather as a family. We, the adults, must pass it on our places of business, the students in their schools, in the communities, in the towns, in the cities. And only if there's respect and tolerance towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out towards one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. When I speak in schools, the students will hear me say that it's not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. Please, please, let us all remember these messages and live by them. We're all aware that 6 million of our people were murdered during the Shoah. The population of the state of Georgia is approximately 10 million. Can you possibly imagine almost 2 out of every 3 people in the state of Georgia wiped out? The 6 million also represent 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. Among them were 1.5 million children. We also need to remember that there were 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. Among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them, very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. That would hide them in the attics, that would hide them in the basements. Farmers would hide them out in the barns. They were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages, messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and certainly apply to today's world situation, and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. Okay, I now need to share something with you about a very special lady, my mother. By Jordan, a very special lady. This was my mom on her 104th birthday. Mom sadly passed away 6 weeks short of 105. Amazing, amazing lady, beautiful and wise in all areas, remarkable. There were two things that my mother demanded of my brother and me when we came to America. Number one, learn English, learn it quickly. Number two, work as hard as you can in school and at work in order to succeed. My mother was 40 years old when she came to America, knew no English, learned to read, write, and speak a magnificent English, a remarkable lady. My brother, Albert, passed away 3 years ago, dealt with this altogether differently than I do. Did not speak about it the way you heard it from me this evening. Was happily married, lived in California, but by choice did not bring children into this world. Had a very difficult time with organized religion, including ours. All of that made me very sad. But I did not fault Albert. We have to remember he was 2 years older than I am, was with my father in the men's section, and I am convinced that he saw and experienced things that I did not. God, Hashem, put us in this world. It was a beautiful mind. It is this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. Therefore, men did this to one another. But did he have to make it so bitterly cold when we were standing out there on the Pell all day? I have a direct line. I asked loads of questions. Don't get too many answers, but that's okay. Faith I will always have. After all, here I am, 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren, from whom generations will be forthcoming. He made sure that enough of us survived so that we will always be here. I am proud of my faith, as I'm certain you, if there's a mixed audience, you are proud of your faith and of your heritage. But please, 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 let us all remember to respect the right of others to their belief. Be kind and good and respectful and tolerant and compassionate towards one another. That is the basis for peace. Had there been respect and tolerance towards one another some 70, 80 years ago, I would not be here this evening to share that dark period of our history with you. 9/11 would not have occurred. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, all these countries that are in such turmoil would be peaceful countries for its people. Be kind and good and respectful towards one another, please. There is very little that we can do against the negativity in our world, but how we treat, behave, and reach out towards one another, that is entirely up to us. Did I ever find my 4 pebbles? Frequently asked question. I always found my 4 pebbles. I made it my business to find them. I cheated all the time. When I found them, I put them in a safe place. Next time I searched for them and I couldn't find that 3rd one or the 4th one, well, I knew exactly where to go and pick them up. Maybe there was cheating, but it was my game, and guess who made the rules? You need to know that I was only about 9 or 10 years old when things were at its absolute worst. We had nothing to occupy our time with constructively. No paper, no pencils, no books, certainly no games. So I was lucky at such an imaginative mind, and my imaginative games were always based on a positive attitude. I would search for a piece of glass or piece of a mirror, whatever I could find on the dirt ground in Bergen-Belsen. And when the sun would shine, and that didn't happen nearly often enough in that part of Germany, known for bad weather and cloudy skies, but I, Marion, knew that that sun would always come out. And when it did, that little piece of glass would cast a reflection onto the ground, and that little wiggly reflection, it became my pet. As long as the sun would shine, I would have my pet, and my pet would never, ever die. I would also imagine that one day I once again would have my 3 Bs. And these 3 Bs represent our everyday comforts and necessities that we all take so much for granted. First B represented a bed. I knew that someday I once again would have my very own bed with a real mattress, clean sheets, and enough blankets to keep me warm. Second B represented a bath. Warm water, soap, clean towel, and with that would come toothpaste and a toothbrush, of course. And the third B was bread. I knew that someday I once again would have enough bread so that I would never again go hungry. These imaginative games, if you will, they were my survival techniques. They were my survival skills. Do you know that we all have survival techniques and skills within us? When the need arises, we just have to search for them, find them, and be sure that we put them to work. No one is spared adversity. No one is spared hardship. We all have to overcome obstacles at one time or another. But with perseverance, with determination, with faith, and above all, hope, one can overcome just about anything and everything. Above all, never, ever give up hope. It is not so much what happens to a person, it's how we deal with the situation that makes the difference. Nathaniel is from New York. He went to Bradley University in Peoria. Lucky me. He went home on vacations, and way back then in the 1950s, long distance telephone calls were very expensive. There were no computers, there were no emails, no texting and whatever else is out there. But for a 3-cent stamp, there really was such a thing as a 3-cent stamp, we would write to one another every single day. Major problems, major problems. In his letters to me, he would add 5 words that he asked me to define and put into a sentence. That's a lot of nerve for all I had to do, but I knew he meant to help me with my English, and I guess it did work. So thank you, Nathaniel.
My pleasure, Marion.
I, on the other hand, would write my letters in rough draft with a dictionary by my side, and only when I was satisfied with the way the letter was written would I dare mail it to him. Talking about a dictionary, my father always carried a little chunky German English dictionary with him and would study it in secret whenever possible, always with the hope that someday he would reach America. When we came to the United States back in 1948 and approached New York Harbor, we were told the night before that if we wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, we needed to be on deck bright and early the next morning. You can be sure that each and every one of us was on deck to greet and be greeted by that magnificent symbol, the symbol of freedom that had been denied us for so many years. And when the tall figure of that longed for symbol appeared, I became too choked up to talk. So many emotions seized me at once: joy and gratitude, bitterness for the cruelties we and so many others had suffered, and deep, deep sadness that Papa, my father, could not share this moment with us. He would never know that we had reached America at last. When we crossed the Verrazano Bridge, I don't know if you all know the Verrazano Bridge in New York. It's a long bridge that connects the borough of Staten Island with that of Brooklyn. And when we reach a certain point on the bridge, I will always crane my neck to see the Statue of Liberty. It's the most magnificent, meaningful, beautiful sight. We returned to Germany on various occasions. The very first time we returned was back in 1995. It was the 50th anniversary of our liberation. And we visited my father's grave. And the reason my father and about 60 others have a private resting place in that farm village where we were liberated, because they died after some of the chaos had subsided. Those who died early on were all buried in mass graves. We also went to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen looks nothing the way I remembered it. Had been burned down under the direction of President Eisenhower, who was then the commander of the Allied forces, because the conditions of the camp would have created tremendous health hazards for that entire region of Germany. So today, other than the newly built documentation exhibition centers, Bergen-Belsen looks like a park. Green grass, shrubs, trees, not bad looking at all, except for the mounds everywhere. Mounds with plaques that read, "Here lie 1,000, here lie 2,500." These are the mass graves of our people. We also went to Hoya near Hanover, our former hometown. And there we were greeted by public officials who over and over again apologized for what was done to our people back then. And there was a young non-Jewish couple born after the war who took us to the Jewish cemetery, which was in terrible disarray, had not been cared for since 1938. And there, among the toppled over stones, was a brand new shiny granite footstone with the inscription: Zur Erinnerung an die zerstörte Grabstelle der Familie Blumenthal, Hoya 1894 bis 1938. In memory of the desecrated plot of the Blumenthal family, Hoya 1894 to 1938, placed there by this non-Jewish young couple, unbeknownst to us, a most beautiful, generous, kind gesture. Never thought that I would refer to non-Jewish Germans in such glowing terms. It's people like these that renew one's faith in humanity and that become dear, dear friends of ours. And each time we return, I speak in schools and universities, and yes, sometimes I speak in churches, and it's always tremendously well received. And then one of the times was in 2010 when we returned, because at that time a brand new public high school was in my former hometown, was named in my honor. So now we have the Marion Blumenthal Oberschule in Hoya, a tremendous celebration and very courageous for this little town to redress what happened so many years ago in their midst. And the night before the celebration, we commemorated the night of broken glass. All difficult trips, yes, but no regrets having returned. Need you to know, talking about Germany, that that country is doing everything in its power to continually remind its people what happened back then. It is mandatory for the subject to be taught in their schools. And they have various ways of reminding them. We had the opportunity to visit their parliament. Their parliament has murals, huge murals on their walls depicting the night of broken glass. So there are other various reminders that they post to their citizens. I'll take a few questions before I wind down.
All right, thank you. Incredible. Thank you for sharing your story. I was looking at the chat and I forgot to mention, I wrote in the email, but I forgot to mention that people can write in the chat. So if you have a question that you'd like Mrs. Lazan to address, please write it in the chat and I will mention it. Okay, great.
In the meantime, let's see, what are some of the questions? Okay, I'm very often, especially by the students, by the younger generation, asked whether I have a number on my arm. I do not. That was done, we learned just not so long ago, that was done in Auschwitz only. There were hundreds of camps major camps,
So cool.
minor camps, sub camps, whatever camps. But it was only in Auschwitz where they burnt the number on them, obviously for no reason other than to dehumanize our people and to torment our people a little bit more. And then to think that these men and women went home to their own families at night as though they had a 9-to-5 job. And I'm sure you all know that Germany back then was one of the most cultured nations in the world in the 30s. And this is what they did to their citizens and to innocent men, women, and children. Incomprehensible. I can't go there to explain. It is no explanation. Did I ever meet Anne Frank? Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen in March of 1945. But I'm sure you all understand and realize that her name did not become well known until after her diary was found and published. And we only know her story while she was in hiding. We know very little, if anything, about her years in the camps. And the story you heard this evening really pretty much picks up where hers left off. And in addition to that, she was 6 years older than I am. And you know very well that a 15-year-old has next to nothing to do with a 9-year-old. So if I might have seen her, it meant very little at the time. September 11th, 2001. None of us will ever be allowed to forget that date as long as we live. At that time, Nathaniel and I were in Florida visiting our children and speaking in schools. And because all planes were grounded, we chose to drive home. And as we approached New York and crossed the Verrazano Bridge, amidst the smoking ruins of the Twin Towers, we could see the Statue of Liberty holding high the torch of freedom. It is that flame of freedom that the terrorists sought to destroy, but could not and never will, because we will take good care of our freedom. We will safeguard our freedom. We will not and must not take our freedom for granted. Let us all, each and every one of us, redouble our efforts to be kind and good towards one another. And with that, I wish each and every one of you, your children, grandchildren, and all succeeding generations, a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. We have a thank you for sharing your story. And I can speak on behalf of myself. Incredibly moving, incredibly inspirational, just a mix of emotions. And just, I want to thank you with every ounce and fiber of my being for bearing witness and telling your story. And we will definitely pass it forward and keep your story alive. A few questions did come in that I think might be interesting to address if you're up to it. So a question on I guess a more technical question. How did your mother earn a living in those early years in the US?
Okay.
Yeah.
My mother didn't know the language. She was first a housekeeper for a Jewish family in Peoria, and which was to our benefit. She got leftover food that we were able to bring home. I got hand-me-down clothes. And
I met you.
And Nathaniel I wore one dress. It was a navy woolen dress with a little emblem. And Nathaniel met me wearing that dress. You want me to tell them that, right, Nathaniel? Okay. I did. I said it was Yom Kippur. Okay. Right. I did say that we met on Yom Kippur. Right. Right. Anyway. So that is, and then little by little, you need to know that she worked so hard, as did my brother and I, to get out of that place where they put us. It was a small house with 2 other families. We had one kitchen with a wooden ice box. That wooden ice box had a block of ice. The iceman came 3 times a week to replace, you can't replace it. I mean, just to put a cube in there. And that was for 3 families. Well, it was high time for us to get out of there as fast as we could, and we did. And then after Mom was done with that housekeeping job, then she was a seamstress. She was multi-talented. She was a wonderful bookkeeper in Germany. She was a wonderful seamstress, and she worked in a tailor shop. And little by little, she made a little bit more money each time. But a very industrious, amazing lady. Yeah.
And she lived till, you said, till almost 105.
105.
Can I know
6
her?
weeks short.
Unbelievable.
It's that
Unbelievable.
inner strength, that fortitude, the will to go on, the will to succeed, the will to, you name it. Your mental attitude has much to do with your physical well-being.
Yeah.
And she lived to be almost 105.
Amazing.
Very
Amazing.
strong. Yeah.
One final question that a few people wrote in different ways, but it's really the same question. And I would say it's probably the most practical, at least for today, just where we are. It's the practical question. And really there's two parts to it. Number one, do you see any similarities today with anti-Semitism and just in general? Do you see any similarities to the way things were back in Germany in the 1930s, 1940s, number one? And number two is, what can we do today? What can we do today? And I know you touched on it, but people did ask this question. So I feel like I should just, I feel like I should ask it on behalf of those that are wondering. So reflections on where we are today, and also what can we do? How do we address the challenge?
Anti-Semitism today is what anti-Semitism was then, except that they followed. This was organized by the government. Okay, we're not there. We will never get there. No, I was going to say we're not there yet. We're not going to get there, period. But that was coordinated by the government. It was a law for these anti-Semitic laws to be enforced. So that's different from today. But you know, it's sad to see that it's going on in pockets of America and in the world. And that has happened for centuries. So
that's why we keep speaking to.
That's why I keep speaking, and it's thoroughly draining. I don't know if I mentioned you, I'm speaking 5 times this week alone, okay? And it's just ongoing. I surely thought with this pandemic and I couldn't travel, that this would be the end. I figured someday I got to stop. So maybe he's giving me a message, but apparently it's not, because I've got about 40, 50 presentations lined up through the middle of June. So it's ongoing. What can we do to make this a more peaceful world? One by one by one, be kind and good and respectful and tolerant towards one another. Period. Had there been respect and tolerance back then, this would not have happened. So that's my only advice. And education. You should be, education is of utmost importance pertaining to the subject. Okay.
Beautiful, powerful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to give you a blessing that you should continue to have good health and all the strength that you need. The number one, keep on sharing your story. 40, 50 more presentations just in the next few months. Gewaltig. I mean, it's like, may you continue to have opportunities to share the story. I mean, you continue to have the good health and the strength to share your story, which is so important. I mean, the possibility to hear the story from someone who lived through it is I don't think any of us here take it for granted, and we are very grateful. And I also want to especially mention, or as well mention, a wishing of good health to your husband, Nathaniel, who I know, as you mentioned tonight, and I also know from David, who's a very big partner in all that you do. And Nathaniel, I know you're listening, because we heard you on off camera before. I know you're here, and I know you're listening, and I want you to know that we care about you, and we're sending lots of love.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Blessings for Refuah Shlema, and you should have only good health, and you should continue to have many more years alongside your wonderful wife to share the story and to continue to Shep, lots of
definitely is.
nachas from the kids.
She definitely is my Eshet Hayo. No
Yeah.
doubt about that. Thank you.
Pleasure, pleasure. Thank you both. Mrs. Lazan, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I know that I will be forever changed by hearing it. And I see in the comments as well, just similar gratitude. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining, and let us carry this message of hope and tolerance and faith and promise for a better future in all of our hearts. And let's make this world truly a world in which that has the values that we want to see for all of us.
Thank you so much. And a Chag Kasher v'Sameach to each and every one of you, of us. And many, many thank yous again for having given me the opportunity to be with you all this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy
Thank
Pesach.
you, Jordan.
Lots of love. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night.
David, wherever you are.
He's there. All right. Thank you.